Welcome to Chatting with Chelsea's. I'm here with Chelsie Copenhaver. She's a librarian within the Pasadena Library System. A librarian within the Pasadena Library System. Thank you so much for coming in like this is a studio, for coming and talking with me today. I know our particular crowdfunding is all about fantasy novels and fantasy books and YA a little bit. The big trend right now is romantasy novels, which we'll talk about in a second. It's the what is it, the genre on everybody's lips, but
and other places
and
too.
other places, but it's a genre that's been around for a long time, so we'll get into that. But just to start off, like with a little basic information, how long have you been a librarian for, and kind of what got you interested in the science?
All right, so I have been a librarian in a public library for just over 2 years now. Before that, I worked in a private educational library, and before that, I was a children's bookseller for about a decade. And I just really enjoy books. When I worked at the bookstore, what I loved most about that job was being able to make connections between kids and families and a love of reading. Because I really feel like everybody can love reading. They maybe just don't love reading some of the stuff that has become work for them. And so the chance to really build those connections, to get people interested in reading and to get them, turned into lifelong readers was wonderful.
Did you find that in your experience, particularly working at the bookstore, that you were able to kind of hone in on, like, this might be the perfect book for you, or like, you seem like the type that would really love this genre of fiction or nonfiction?
I really loved doing that, because so often people would come into the bookstore and they would say, well, I'm looking for a book for a 10-year-old boy. And I'm like,
give me more than that.
Great. Those are two things we know about this reader. Are they a 10-year-old boy that's super into like graphic novels and superheroes? Are we going to get him something action-y? Is this like a sensitive 10-year-old boy who maybe wants a more thoughtful, nuanced story? Are they into history? Do they not want a fiction book? Do they want facts? Do they want one of those big, giant encyclopedias that shows you what different cities' cross-sections look like over time? There are so many different kinds of 10-year-old boys. For a lot of kids, the majority of the reading that they do is done at school, and so it is school prescribed reading material. But you find great books in school, and I will say that nowadays, no, I really do mean that.
Like, no, I agree with you. The smile was genuine. I was like, because I immediately thought back to when we read Steinbeck in like 11th grade, and Steinbeck is now one of my favorite authors on the planet. I probably, it would have taken me longer to get to that author were it not for, AP Lit. Well, so that's why I smile, I promise.
Okay. But that's sort of the thing, is even if they are enjoying the things that they are reading at school, they didn't necessarily choose them.
Right.
So when it comes to something that a child would choose to read, it's a little bit more difficult for parents to gauge, because unless you are seeing your child reading a physical book in your presence, you don't know what they're reading. Yeah. And also we get a lot of aunts and uncles. Maybe you see this kid like 3 times a year and you're like, I don't know, last time they were into Star Wars. Do they still like Star Wars? That was a year and a half ago.
To that end, in your experience, have you found children's books in a general way, ones that you really like or you tend to recommend more? And in comparison, what were some of your favorites growing up? I know that's a lengthy question.
So personal taste does impact a lot of what you recommend. When people used to check out at the bookstore I worked at, you could usually tell who they had spoken to.
Okay.
Based on what they came back with. We try to be very objective in the book selling. We try to match people up with the correct book, but you are kind of pulling from your own knowledge.
Yeah.
And sometimes that's more limited. I will say straight up, there were customers that came to me and said they wanted something in particular, like usually it was like very hard sci-fi, where they were like, we want spaceships, we want laser guns, and I'm like, oof, you are not getting that from me, man.
Yeah.
I know like 3 of those and you probably already read them. Let me go grab my coworker over here. Right, buddy, they want spaceships. Go. For me, I will say I did go through a huge fantasy phase as a child. Between the ages of about 11 to 14, if it did not have a talking cat, a girl with a sword, or like a dragon on the cover, I did not care about that book. I would read it, I would, parse it, I'd get an A on the paper or whatever, but I did not care. So I did bring a few of my favorites to talk about.
Show me.
Let's see, I think I'm only going to do like the top 4. Everybody knows Howl's Moving Castle.
Yeah.
So the Miyazaki did make a movie about it, and it's a wonderful movie, but it's so different from the book.
I've never read this. This was one that I think I didn't know existed until the film.
It's wonderful. So Diana Wynne Jones, much like another author we're going to talk about, Patricia C. Reed, has a deep love of fairy tales and of fairy tale structure and fairy tale tropes, but she also recognizes that they can be that they're there to be kind of played with. We're at a point now where we don't need to take these as divine ordinances. We can sort of play with them a little bit and have fun. In the book itself, as opposed to the movie is much more about sort of the big conflict, the war going on. And in this, the war is still there, but it's taken a back seat a little bit to, like, we spend so much more time playing around with these fairy tale fantasy tropes, with these switched identities. And Sophie, when she thinks about herself as an older sister, it really is in the context of stories. It's in the context of the older sibling doesn't go on these adventures, or when they do, they do not have these fantastical adventures. They go and they fail, and then the younger sibling goes, and they get it.
Yeah.
So I really love this. There are 2 sort of sequels, follow-up books, and Diana Wynne Jones has a great sort of boy wizard series, The Chronicles of Crestomanchi.
Okay. We love a chronicle.
Yeah. So she's just a wonderful author. I should check her out. Next up, one of my favorite series is The Enchanted Forest Chronicles by Patricia C. Reed. This is about a princess named Cimarron. And Cimarron is just a little bit too tall and a little bit too headstrong to be the kind of princess that her parents really wish she would be. And they're like, oh, man, nobody wants to marry off our daughter. She talks to them. She can look them in the eye when they dance, and they don't like that. What can we do to make her more of a catch? And they're like, well, we hire a dragon, and the dragon will come and kidnap her, and then the prince would have to go and rescue her, and that would add a little bit of a lure. And she's like, well, I'm not gonna wait around for this. This is dumb. And she just goes up to where the dragons live, knocks on one of their cave doors, and is like, hey, I'd much rather be here. Do any of you need like a housekeeper?
What year did both of these come out, would you say, like, just roughly?
Golly. Well, let's see. They put that information on the inside.
We're learning things.
So 1990. And then there were...
Sorry about that. But I love just what you're talking about with starting to play with the tropes a little bit and giving, modern girls a little bit more to go off of than just that typical, like, I lost a shoe and then the prince comes and gets me and we're living happily ever after. Like, it's those seeds of, like, that I feel like maybe have grown to modern day fantasy of, like, taking that idea even further.
Yeah. And the thing that I love especially about, like, Reed and Jones is you can tell that they love this. They're not, like, poking fun at a genre because they don't love it. They love it. So it's the difference between, like, when your friend makes fun of you for your quirks and foibles and when some random person off the street that you know does it.
They're doing it with affection.
Yeah.
And I think in that playfulness, it allows the genre to grow that much further. It's just like stretching the bounds a little bit.
Another one that is much older is fantasy classic Peter S. Beagle's The Last Unicorn, also made into an animated film. And this one, especially when I was at the children's bookstore, I recommended it as a lifetime book.
Okay.
Because what you get from the story changes depending on how old you are when you read it. The story is about a unicorn who one day looks around her enchanted woods and realizes that she hasn't seen another unicorn in a really, really long time. And she wonders if what she's hearing from the people who are riding through her forest are true, that there are no more unicorns, that they're all gone, and she is the last of her kind. So she has to leave her enchanted woods, which is her domain and offers her protection, and venture out into the world, where she goes on this grand adventure and meets all sorts of fun characters and comes back changed, irrevocably changed. Yeah. And when you're a kid, you're like, this is a great book about a unicorn. We love a book with a unicorn in it. But when you get older, you realize how much of the story is about how going through life changes you. At a certain point in the book, the unicorn is turned human. And she realizes, for the first time, she experiences aging. She experiences mortality. She experiences love. And she can't go back to being a unicorn in the same way that she was before.
Like this parable for youth, this parable for, like you said, growth and change, and like it's lost on somebody under a certain age, but once you start to go through that, you're like, ooh, oh, that's beautiful. When was the last time you read it?
About 5 years ago, I try to read it at least once every decade.
Yeah.
Because I feel like you pull new things from it each time. And reading it in my 30s, the thing that I pulled from it this time was the Molly Grew character, who's kind of this faded Maid Marian. When she meets the unicorn, she has this big confrontation because the unicorns usually come to beautiful young maidens. And she goes, "How dare you come to me now? Where were you 10 years ago? Where were you 20 years ago? Where were you when I was young and new and beautiful?" And it's the only time that you see the unicorn kind of abashed, because she's like, "Well, I'm here now." She's eventually like, that has to be good enough, because there is no world in which the unicorn came to her previously.
Yeah.
It's not perfect, but it's what you got to work with. I just want to shout out to the entire body of work put out by fantasy author Tamora Pierce. I feel very confident in saying that without her work, as well as the work of authors like, Jones and Reed and McKinley and Pullman and Duane, but Tamora Pierce has really helped shape what the fantasy genre in the YA sphere has become today.
Okay.
She wrote multiple series with strong female characters. It sounds so weird to say that. That's an old term, strong female characters. Really,
it's still relevant.
With female characters with a lot of autonomy, who talked quite frankly about their bodies. All of her books with female characters specifically mention like menstruation. The ones that follow characters from youth to womanhood, like the Protector of the Small series and Alana Trebon, they specifically make mention of like the perils of growing, not perils, the trials of growing up as a woman. This is the third series that she set in her fantasy world of Tortall. And the thing that I love most about it is the first series, Alana, is Song of the Lioness Quartet, is very much like a classic swords and sorcery fantasy adventure. A girl disguises herself as her brother to go to the palace to train to become a knight. It's really wonderful. And this book is about the next girl that has to go to the palace and try and become a knight. But it's about how when she gets to the palace and she begins her training, the world that she's encountering, the challenges that she's encountering as the first out female knight, as the first female knight openly working to become a knight as a girl and a woman, are completely different, because now she's the target of targeted harassment based on her gender. She is also kind of competing against every other boy there, because anytime she fails to measure up, it's because she's a girl. Yeah. But there is something to be said about progressing beyond like the first girl to do something. Because when you are the first girl to do something, you are a legend. Yeah. When you are the second or third or fourth girl to do something, you are just trying to do it. I'm here too.
Not just one of us can do it, guys. Hey, you're not supposed to be up there. How have you found that the fantasy genre has changed since you were reading it as a kid up until now, with new fantasy, new kind of perspective?
To date myself entirely, a lot of those books that I just talked about are products of fantasy in sort of the mid-90s to early 2000s. And when I was a fantasy reader, this was before Twilight. This Hunger Games did not come out until I was in college. So YA as an age group was really in the process of still defining itself. Okay. So a lot of the books that I talked about, despite the fact that I mentioned reading them as kind of a young teen, they would not be considered YA by a lot of modern standards. They would be considered at the upper end of what we would call middle grade. Okay. So sort of a junior high area. Whereas now, YA fantasy is so much more its own established thing, with its own rules and its own tropes.
Kind of aesthetic in general.
Yeah, it definitely has an aesthetic. And again, I feel like that is crafted by the fantasy authors that came before and also keeping up with newer trends. So coming off of my deep love for Tamora Pierce, the way that I feel that she has really crafted what we consider the YA fantasy genre right now is, again, we are getting female-forward, action-fronted fantasy with complex characters that have a very contemporary feel. But the genre is growing and changing to include all sorts of people who definitely were writing fantasy beforehand. But when you talk to fantasy readers, maybe they were not at the forefront. The publishers weren't publishing as much of them.
Yeah.
Because I'd never want to say like there weren't fantasy authors of color. There weren't LGBTQ fantasy authors. There weren't fantasy authors writing about individuals who are neurodiverse or who have disabilities. They definitely were. But they were not being championed the way they are today.
Yeah.
And even with Tamora Pierce, like, if you read, so these are two books that came out fairly recently, the Sir Cally series and Splinter and Ash. Both of these are direct children of people who loved Tamora Pierce. But both feature non-binary protagonists. Both feature a lot of peripheral LGBTQ relationships. And so even with something where you can see these are directly like the brainchild of Tamora Pierce, the genre is growing and evolving. And then as we move on to even things like YA, where you're getting some really amazing stuff coming out, again, with LGBTQ protagonists, with protagonists of color.
A little more attention, a little more championing, a little more space. We talked a little bit before, like just in preparing for this interview, about certain tropes that have changed. I know you mentioned specifically like certain like pushing boundaries, pushing the genre. I really love the concept of the post-chosen one narrative, and I find it so incredibly engaging and fascinating. Can you speak a little bit about that?
Oh, I love that you're giving me the chance to talk about one of my pet theories. So this is something that I started noticing in some fantasy books and other fantasy media a few years ago. And my theory is that part of it is generation of fantasy readers kind of around you and your age and my age who grew up reading a certain wizard boy fantasy series.
The book that shall not be named.
Have grown up, and maybe the actions of somebody who has written a fantasy series like that have kind of soured us on it a little bit. Or it could just be we're growing older. We are living in the happily ever after portion of all of these great big chosen one fantasy adventure stories, and maybe we're not as happy as we thought we were going to be. And ever after lasts a really, really, really long time.
That's so reflective of, like you were saying, like you and I, we've grown up with this trope, and now that we are in the ever after, it's no longer reflective of what we're seeing. Mm-hmm. And as aspirational as that may be, it does beg the question of like, okay, what is your purpose then? Now what are you supposed to do? Like, how does that even, knowing what we know about mental health and like how, trauma affects people, what has happened to these poor characters that have been through, like you said, their whole entire school life trying to defeat evil? There's a practicality to it almost.
And there's a couple like examples that I really enjoy. The first of which being Shauna Maguire's amazing Wayward Children series. Each of these books follows a different character who attends this special school for children who have essentially come back from Wonderland, from Neverland, from wherever they've gone and had their amazing adventure. Sometimes the books will be about their adventure there, but they always end with them coming back to our world. The main thrust of it is when they come back to our world, they don't fit in there anymore. Actual time has passed in that other world.
Like Narnia and things like that, yeah.
They've grown and changed as people, and they really struggle to exist in our world again.
Funny that you mention, and I feel like you've read this one, and it's obviously not quite in the fantasy genre, but like dealing with that same concept of the post-chosen one. The Final Girl Support Group by Grady Hendrix is all about what happens to the final girls after they've they've defeated their big bad. What next?
One of my favorites. So Rainbow Rowell is a YA author. This is actually the second book in her Simon Snow trilogy.
So what beautiful art.
It really is lovely. Which the first book, Carry On, is basically a 400-page Harry Draco /fic with some really good world building in there. But the second book really surprised me because at the end of the first book, I don't think I'm spoiling anything by saying we defeat our big bad. End of the first book, our hero kind of has a lot of what he wants. Yeah. He has a hot vampire boyfriend. He has an online therapist. He has an apartment. And
so sorry, his head is stuck in a bag.
Oh God, should we free him?
Yeah.
But so in our second book, he still has all of those things. He has a hot vampire boyfriend, but he stopped talking to his online therapist. He's laying on the couch. He's drinking too much cider. And his friends and his hot vampire boyfriend are really, really worried about him.
So that becomes a little more real world problem.
Well, and I think that the other aspect of us kind of coming to terms with the promises that fantasy made to us as young readers is the explosion in popularity in the cozy fantasy genre, where we have these fantasy stories that are what I would call lower stakes. The world might not end, the world might not be ending, but bad things could still happen. But there is this sort of promise that when you are done with it, you can be rewarded by this cozy, intimate, low stakes life. There's a lot of emphasis in these books on finding joy, on finding found family, on finding love. And even if you don't get a kingdom as a reward, you get like a little coffee shop where you and your newfound family can like sell tea to gnomes. You can have this sort of cozy, safe, comfortable life. Because we were, in a way, sort of promised that as well, and we did not necessarily get it. Look, I would love to have a bookshop, but the overhead of this town, I would need to inherit so much money.
How Skylight stays in business, I will never know. They've got like the little theater alcove in the back too, and it's like, what front? What front is this?
Plugs for bookstores in Los Angeles. You should definitely visit Skylight and Vromans. Special shout out to my former place of employment, Children's Book World, if you have a child.
There's also Book Soup,
Oh,
right?
Book Soup.
Book Soup is classic. They've been around forever. Oh, there's shout out to Octavia's.
Octavia's
Bookshelf out in Pasadena.
I was there opening day. The line was huge.
One thing I really wanted to talk about too, a big author of the moment is Sarah J. Maas. Am I pronouncing it? It's another name that like, is it Maas? Sarah J. Maas or Sarah... Great, good.
Maas.
One thing I also wanted to talk about is one of the big authors of the moment is Sarah J. Maas. She's best known for books like A Court of Thorns and Roses.
We can just call it ACOTAR.
ACOTAR, which is in this big subgenre of fantasy, romantasy, which has been around forever, since the dawn of time, but is making this kind of resurgence because it's a little titillating, it's a little bit new, when really, you were telling me earlier, its genre is not unlike Outlander or Mists of Avalon, where it is kind of a rite of passage for people that are discovering this genre, or themselves, or sexuality to some degree. This book is being banned and has shown up on several top banned book lists across the United States. Can you speak kind of, obviously a big broad stroke question, can you speak to some of these book bans and how it's affecting libraries?
I will say that from my own personal experience, when I was a kid, we had one parent in our friends group, one of our friends' moms, who was a big romantasy fan. And so we used to just go over to her place and we would borrow things like Kushiel's Dart and the Black Jewel books and Mists of Avalon and Outlander. But I really do feel like taking these books and reading them was a little bit of a rite of passage. There's sort of a teenage rebellious spark in that, in reading stuff that maybe is for grown-ups, has grown-up things in it. And I do want to emphasize that when it comes to the world of book bans and book challenges, Maas is to mix metaphors, a bit of an odd duck in the race, because a lot of the books that are coming under scrutiny are primarily books by authors of color, books that explore topics like gender and sexuality, books that tackle difficult subjects. But for a lot of these books, one of the things that you'll see if you go to like the American Library Association, ALA, each year they put out a top list of the most challenged books. Now, challenged does not necessarily mean banned, but it means that somebody has brought an objection forth.
Okay.
And that could mean anything. That could mean that at some point they have overthrown it, the book is back on the shelves. That could mean that they've taken it off. It could mean that they have put other restrictions on it, like you need a signed permission slip to access certain books, or they've moved the book from like an area that is easily accessible by all ages to an age-restricted area, or just moved it from YA into adult, which would make it harder to find and put that additional barrier in there. But if you look at the lists provided, you will see that a lot of the books that are on some of the most recent lists are there because of their supposed sexually explicit content. And that is something that I think we need to be aware of. The problem is once we start saying that nobody can access these books, nobody can have them in their libraries, that I think is where we're overstepping.
If somebody were to want to help or make a difference or really champion the cause of free speech in library systems, how might they go about that? Or even just like, where should they look for more information on how to combat something like that?
So there's a few different ways that I definitely recommend if this is something that you are concerned about in your community. There are some wonderful ways to take action. The first is just to get involved, to go to your local school board meetings and library board meetings, and to make your voice heard there. But to let them know, to give them your feedback as a member of the community, as a library patron, as someone with children in the school district. Vote in local elections. The jobs of a lot of the people that make decisions on these things are elected. And for me as a librarian, as somebody who works in libraries, if you see something at a library that you like, let people know, and let them know in a way that can be formally documented. Write a comment card, ask to speak to somebody in a higher authority, write an email, something tangible that when they have to go and justify these things they're doing, they can say, our community likes it, our community wants it.
The positive is just as effective, if not more so, than the negative.
And one-on-one with your family, if you have children, let them know that they are free to select their own reading material, and that is something that they should consider a right of theirs, and that they have the rights of a reader, the right to not finish a book they don't like, unless it's for school. You do have to finish those.
This librarian is saying you don't have to finish the book for school if you don't like. No, I'm not kidding.
And if you go to a book club, you have to finish that book.
I'm in the middle of a book for book club right now that I am struggling through. Also, if you're going to donate books to your local library, please make an appointment. Don't put them in the book drop. Don't just drop them off in front of the library. It makes a lot more effort and work for the people that work there in a public works system.
And sometimes it rains.
There's also that.
It's raining right now, so if you've left something outside a library hoping that they will take it in and treasure it, it's wet now.
It's wet. That's what you did. You did that. Thank you so much for taking the time to come out, and this has been so much fun, and I appreciate it so much, and I feel like I'm walking away much more informed, not only in the literary world, but just what to read next.
I feel like I just word vomited at you for
I
about
love
an
it
hour.
though. This is why I was like, and we had small cat time, which
Cat
is always
time?
good. This has been perfect. Thank you so much.
Thank you.